Welcome to Module 4, Week 4. The title of the lecture today is Air Freight Market Characteristics. The questions we're seeking to answer today are: what are the main approaches to segmentation of goods transported by air cargo carriers? What are the main commodities transported globally from region to region, and why do they differ? And what is cold chain logistics, and what are the main types of cargo carried? Our readings this week come from Morrell. There's a few pages there. Also, 2-3 readings there from Sales. So, in many ways, if we're going to have a look at the air cargo market characteristics, demand is a key issue. Last week we spoke about trends in growth, in volumes. We looked at trade routes, we looked at hub airports. I guess one of the reasons why demand is such a critical issue, particularly in the air cargo industry, we only have to look at that first slide that I showed last week, which showed the growth rates of air cargo for the last 10 years. If we look at those, they're hardly what you would call stable. So for any air cargo business trying to make a profit in that particular climate, it's a big challenge, particularly given the variability of those growth rates. So for anybody to be successful in management of an air cargo carrier, they are required to have a really good understanding of the underlying demand for air cargo. And this process really begins by understanding the types of commodities that are carried on air cargo routes. So what they're made up, what the main percentages are, so by volume, but also by share. And we'll look at that today. The second part of that issue of understanding demand is to look at that market with a full knowledge of the types of commodities that are carried and make some form of segmentation analysis of those commodities. And I'm going to put forward an approach to segmenting the market for air cargo, and that same approach is what you will use in assignment 3 when you're making decisions about the market that you're going to target with a new aircraft that you're bringing into your fleet. And then we'll have a look at how that overlaps with the current main trade routes and what the makeup of some of those commodities are. So I guess one of the key issues when it comes to demand for air cargo, as I said before, is understanding the commodities that are carried. Because in many ways, demand for air cargo is a byproduct of a demand for a particular type of good. So there are particular types of goods that are in demand, and with considerations such as speed of delivery, the cost of those goods, the benefits of air cargo versus other forms of mode to move that cargo, goes into that decision-making process. So assignment 1 was very much about some of those decisions that businesses have to make in regards to their determination of whether it should be air cargo, whether it should be truck cargo, sea cargo or rail cargo. And much of this is based around a competition between air cargo and the other modes. And what we find is that when we look at the competition on short to medium routes, most of that competition is going to be air cargo, rail and road. And on the long haul routes, unexpectedly, the competition is mainly with sea freight, which, as we know, is a much cheaper option. In the first lecture, I put forward that idea that 1% of the global volume of cargo that's moved around the globe is moved by air. So the other cargo, 99% of it, is carried by other forms, 90% of which is going to be by sea. So what that tells us, what the underlying message is in that statistic, is that the costs associated with, so the value per kilo of air cargo is going to be higher than those other modes. So what we find is that countries who are producing capital goods, producing consumer goods, typically are moving, such as high-tech goods, tend to be the highest users of air cargo. And that's because the consumer goods, the capital goods, are high value to weight. So that's a logical understanding of that. And in addition to that, what's also contributing to that demand scenario and that decision around air cargo is the fact in the last 20 years we've seen global value chains move from about 36% of movement of goods around the globe to around about 50%. And many of those components which move around there, which are of high value, use air cargo in their form of transport. Last week we noted that the majority of air cargo shipments are through the Northern Hemisphere, and this has shifted over time from North America to Europe. So there's been a major shift in where the volumes of air cargo are moving. So they're moving from Asia either to North America or they're moving to Europe. So 50% of the global cargo, freight tonnes per kilometres, is either carried from, to, or within Asia. We also spoke about the fact that there's quite considerable directional imbalances, and typically those imbalances are in favour of Asia, and they're moving from the manufacturing to the distribution centres. So the manufacturing centres of Asia to the distribution centres of Europe and also North America, as well as the production centres of Asia to the consumption centres of the developing countries in Europe and also North America. And it's often reflective of the economic profile and the activity in that particular importing region. Something else that impacts on that directional imbalance, and it can have a positive and negative effect, is this idea of currency exchange fluctuations. I'm not sure if you were watching the news closely on Monday, but we had a serious correction in the stock exchange when China, in response to America's additional tariffs, actually reduced their currency. Now, what we know about reducing a country's currency is that that makes their goods cheaper in other countries. So it's, I guess the rationale behind that is to seek to increase that level of demand for those goods in those other countries. Now, certainly global markets didn't respond positively to that, and I suppose it was probably one of those shots across the bow, if you like, as a couple of days later China made another correction to minimise the impact of that reduction in their currency. But essentially that currency devaluation is going to present some countries with a better opportunity, greater buying power to buy more goods. which can have a further impact on directional imbalances. Now, industry analysts expect these imbalances to continue, notwithstanding the fact that in Asia, in China and India, there are growing middle classes. So growing middle classes are going to demand more high-tech, high-quality goods, which could make a change to that particular imbalance. Has anybody got any questions about demand for air cargo? Okay. This particular slide gives you the world trade by commodity. So what it shows you there is, as I pointed out before, so less than 1% of all commodities are moving by air. So we can see that there. However, the vast majority of cargo that's moved around the globe is actually, and about 80%, is bulk cargo. Bulk cargo is moved on container ships. However, there is a middle ground where air cargo gets additional volumes of goods depending on whether the situation is, I suppose, viable to carry that air cargo. Now, to give you a sense of the typical types of volumes of particular commodities, Deganis did a study, and what he found was that 33%, so a third of all air cargo moved around the globe, are manufactured goods. So the equipment, computers, electronic goods, so high-tech equipment. So that makes up a third of the goods moved by air cargo. He also found that machinery and transport equipment, capital equipment, automotive parts made up another 33%. So we've got 66% of goods that fall into that category of manufactured goods, machinery and transport. And the other third was that mixture of foodstuffs, medicals, pharmaceutical goods, as well as chemicals, a 33%. Now, if you're an air cargo carrier and you're part of the management team and you've been that's been passed on to you as your basis for segmentation of the market to determine who you're going to present your product, your services to, you're going to want more information than's provided there. There's not enough information in that particular analysis to allow you to successfully market your business. And so we'll get some more information on that. One of the things to remember when it comes to air cargo, that it is always, it's constantly is the word I'm looking for, constantly under competition from the other modes. And that's because surface rates can be 10 to 15% less. So air freight rates can be 10 to 15% more than surface rates. So it's constantly under competition. So there's got to be a compelling rationale for using air cargo. And the rule of thumb to that regard is that the cost of using air cargo is more viable when the final market price of the goods is high relative to weight. So if you use that as a rule of thumb, if you like, that would give you a strong sense of what goods are moved by air cargo and what goods are moved by surface transport. It's not the only reason, but it's a strong, compelling reason. Now, according to the authors of Boeing World Air Cargo Forecast, they found, on average, there's a strong tendencies for goods to be moved by air if they were valued at more than 16 US dollars, which is about 14 euros. So what they said is that that's that nominal value when using air cargo, the value of the product is at $16 or 14 euros. So, we're going to use an example to look closely at the type of products which are carried by air cargo. So we're going to unpack some of those 30%, 330% Dolganis study to understand a little bit more about each of those groupings. Now, this particular slide is on the imported air freight imports by commodity type in 2016 into the EU. So we're using that. So all the air cargo that came into the EU from all over the globe is listed here. And what we see there straight up is that 60%, 66% of the goods going into Europe are machinery and transport equipment, which was identified by Dolganis, and also manufactured articles, which was the other 30%. And I suppose where this information is more informative, as we've now got a list of other products that are carried by air cargo. Agricultural products, chemicals, foodstuffs, and also other mineral. It's quite finite. One of the other things on this slide, which is quite telling, is the unit price for €1 for the particular goods. So if we look at that machinery, transport equipment, manufactured articles, it's 126 euros of unit value per kilo. So it's quite high value to weight. And that's consistent with this idea that air cargo should have a high value to weight. And as we go through there, we can see a lot of these particular goods are high value to weight, which gives it a big tick or a big plus when we talk about viability for air cargo. A couple of interesting aspects here is that when we look at agricultural products and live animals, which equate to 18%, almost 20%, the unit price is €5, well below what should make it viable for air cargo. Despite that, it's a significant percentage of the goods imported into Europe. Foodstuffs and animal fodder, similar type of scenario. Yeah.
Is that because even though they don't have a high price, they have a quick perishability with life cycle?
That plays a role, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, but that's certainly a key issue around perishability. Yeah, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So what I'm going to do now is just break down relatively quickly each of those categories, just to give you a sense of what makes up those categories. So that first category, which we saw 66%, is machinery, transport equipment and manufactured articles. So we see electrical machinery, 16%, non-electrical machinery, 14%. So we're looking at high-tech type products, around about 30% of the goods. Travel goods are quite high. Transport equipment, which is most likely going to be aircraft and automobile and other forms of transport, at 4%. And while only a very small percentage, it's very significant, which is gold coins and metals at 0.1%. And other, which is a range of other things that fit into that. Once again, we have a look at the unit value just to see if that's consistent with our ideal that air cargo is going to be beyond that 14 euros. And you can see there that the majority of them are well in advance of 14 euros, which is expected to be that sort of break-even viable point for air cargo. One of the interesting numbers there is gold coins and metals. Their per kilo price is 25,000 euros. And this particular section is that largest section of all goods imported into Europe. Looking at electrical machinery, as I said before, they've got a significant percentage, a high amount of value, almost twice as much value as there is in volume, and a higher per unit amount of 166 euros. Electrical machinery globally, from a global perspective, can be up to 3 times more value than there are in volumes, particularly for those more high-tech shipments. I suppose one of the interesting characteristics of electrical machinery is that it's had a pretty flat percentage increase over the last 10 years. It's been around about 2%. If we look at the average of air cargo over the last 10 years, it's been about 3.7 to 4%. So it's below the average tonnage growth. However, the value continues to grow. And one of the explanations for this is a miniaturisation of technology. And this is more about the fact that the technology that we're carrying around is moving away from computers, and it's moving more to tablets and also mobile phones, with the tonnage of computers declining by about 5% a year. And this is a global statistic. By contrast, telecommunications equipment, say tablets, mobiles, is growing at about 3% an annum. And I suppose a further reinforcement of this move toward mobiles is that around about 2009, so around about 10 years ago, access to the internet increased from close to zero by mobiles to around about 50% of internet usage. Moving on to non-electrical equipment, so we're talking about appliances, we're talking about engines, we're talking about other apparatus, often capital equipment, investment goods. Often these goods are used to, I suppose, provide the infrastructure for manufacturing facilities to actually, with high value equipment. A significant percentage, around about 15%, and in terms of value on a par with non-electrical machinery in terms of tonnages. In terms of value, a healthy value around about 17%, and a high unit value. So once again, high value to weight, consistent with this idea of air cargo. Globally, I guess as a general statistic, these shipments are typically moved from developed countries to developing economies who are building and expanding their manufacturing capability. A couple of other categories that fit into this particular group is travel goods. Travel goods, as well as footwear and clothing, around about 12% of goods being imported into Europe. 3% of value, so not such a high amount of per kilo price, and that's still 27 euros, which is quite significant in its own right. Now, the majority of goods in this particular category are going to be clothing and they're going to be footwear. And typically they're either going to be designer fashion, and most of that designer fashion is moving from Europe and North America to other regions to satisfy demand for fashion. But what we're also seeing is an increase of volumes of these particular goods also coming into Asia to satisfy the emerging middle classes of India and China. In addition to the designer type fashion, you've also got the inexpensive fashion and footwear, densely stacked and exported from Asia, typically China, India and Bangladesh. Another category is transport equipment and parts, 4.3%. So we'd be putting that into the category of probably most closely aligned to component parts and goods required for additional manufacturing. Significant value and sitting at about 134 euros per kilo. Automotive, aircraft parts make up the main part of that, and as I said before, quite appropriate for global value chains. I suppose it's mainly about the unit price that gold coins and metals and can isolate itself as a significant category in its own right. Very small volume, but significant in terms of its value. Its value can fluctuate. If we went back 10 years, we'd say that the value might have been around about 4%. It's now around about 13%. And a lot of that's got to do with the move towards the investment in gold over the last 10 years. Now, moving on to a category of agricultural products and live animals, what we can see here is that fresh fruit and vegetables make up about 9% of that particular category. Live animals, once again, quite a discrete category, but very small, around about 0.1%, and then other, which is a whole range of other perishable type products. We can see that the value it doesn't necessarily contribute a lot to the value of the sector or the overall imports into Europe. And the interesting statistic here is that fresh and frozen are sitting at about €4 in terms of value per kilo, so it's quite low. However, live animals is a lot more appropriate with air cargo at 96%. So if we look a little bit closer at the frozen and fresh vegetables, as I said before, quite a significant segment in its own right, almost 10%, doesn't contribute very much in terms of value, and it's got a very low per kilo price. However, despite this, and despite the fact that it's well below this €14 threshold, shipments tend to carry this form of air cargo mainly to support weaker round trips. So, and that sort of goes to the heart of your question, Ryan, is that instead of sending back a half-empty carrier, you're going to utilise lower-priced air cargo to move these perishable goods. I think that's so. Despite its low value, in fact, temperature-controlled goods have actually increased over time to around about 3% since 2006, and that's over and above the growth rate of many other types of air cargo during that time. As I said, air cargo is constantly under competition, particularly for those goods which are low priced. And as evidenced by the Peru to US asparagus market, if we went back 20 years, 80% of that was carried by air. That's changed around now that 80% of those goods are carried by sea. So it's a switch to sea. So there is a limit for how low a particular perishable product can go in terms of its ability to be moved by air cargo. And a little bit further investigation into that tells us that if you're comparing the unit price of perishables going by air cargo versus the unit price of perishables going by sea cargo, what you'd find is that the per unit price is 4 times less than it is for air cargo. So there is a point that perishables get to that they are no longer viable for air cargo. Now, while it didn't come out in the statistics, flowers are a significant element of the market of perishables. There wasn't a specific characteristic there, but quite a number of flowers go into Europe, and typically those flowers are coming from South America, Africa and Asia. And leading the way is Africa via Kenya, with more than 50% of the volumes of flowers going into Europe coming from Kenya, Ethiopia 26%, and also Ecuador around about 8%. My understanding is that the imports from Ecuador are a relatively new thing, and probably goes to some of the way of explaining how the volumes of flower imports into EU grew by 16%, which is quite significant over the period up to 2016, despite the fact that the price of the flowers went down from €5.40 to €3. And much of the reason for this, I suppose, the devaluation of those prices is probably likely that they were responding to the additional competition from Ecuador. Just a couple of aspects of the distribution chain which are a little bit different for both Europe and Asia and the US and the UK, is that distribution of, and this goes to some way to when you're looking at the actual cool chain that gets those flowers to those markets. European Asian flowers are distributed mainly through flower shops. So there's a wholesaler network which is linked to the flower auction in Netherlands, which is the typical approach. And it even works on the basis that some air shippers will fly into Amsterdam to access the Dutch auction. However, and I suppose it's inevitable, that this is changing to some degree due to the access to electronic viewing platforms. I suppose conversely, if we looked at North America and the UK flower market, what we see is that most of the distribution there is through supermarkets, and they typically access their supplies directly from overseas companies. This little graphic just gives us a sense of seasonality of cut flowers between the period 2014 to 2016. And what you can see there is over the course of a year there are a number of peaks of around about that 20 to 30%. Typically they are around Valentine's Day, and I'm sure you could probably guess these off the cuff. Mother's Day, sitting in around about there, and also Christmas, so as a lead up to Christmas. A quick snapshot of the other perishables that fit into this agricultural products and live animals are tropical fruits, fish, asparagus, beef and horse meat, coming from a range of different markets going into Europe. One of the characteristics, if you look at most of those particular countries, which is consistent with this export of perishables, is the idea that the majority of these countries have low labour rates. So low labour rates is an opportunity to keep the price of the product as low as possible, which actually means that the air freight is actually going to be the largest part of the price that's paid by the consumer at the other end. So as a consequence, exports of perishables are typically only possible when they're low enough to enable the final price to be accepted by the final consumer. So in other words, is that consumer prepared to pay a premium? If they are, then those goods can actually utilise air cargo. And one of the ways of doing this, I'd be surprised if there would be very much excess air cargo space, say, in the freighter aircraft. But when you consider that the wide-bodied aircraft these days have up to 20 tonnes of available space for cargo, then that does present an opportunity for those passenger carriers to take advantage of that particular freight. Another discrete category that we isolated there were live animals. a very small category, but certainly if you're a marketing person from an air cargo carrier, one of the things about this particular category is it's quite discreet. And that's one of the challenges when you're marketing your goods to customers, is finding discrete markets that will respond in a particular way. Live animals might be one of those markets. Doesn't necessarily contribute a lot in terms of value, but as you can see, it fits the bill in terms of the unit value to weight proposition of 96 euros. As you would probably guess if I gave you the question, it's coming from pets, agricultural animals, horses, zoo animals and exotics. So quite expected. In terms of the largest category, probably what stands out within that group is going to be horses, particularly race horses, which are buy and sold and used at international venues. The Middle East and Hong Kong are two of the big customers in that regard. Hong Kong also having an interest in horse breeding, as does the Middle East, to be fair. There are also events that use horses, such as polo, so international sport utilising horses, so they move between Europe, North America and also South America. And this, as we saw before, really remains viable because of the commercial value of the horses themselves. They're usually quite a valuable commodity. Over the year, probably in the vicinity of around about 20,000 horses are shipped by air transport. And to participate in that particular situation, there's an expectation of customised stalls. So as you can see on this particular, the pictures, you customised stalls, air conditioning, well, I think that's expected if you're travelling at 30,000 feet, and even to the point of having accompanying attendants are now commonplace when you're moving live animals around the globe. So if you were a air cargo carrier and you were looking to get into this particular market, so if you wanted to market your products, one of the things that you need to know is that this particular industry is heavily regulated. So it's heavily licensed and requires veterinary checks along the way. And the expectation as an airline, is that you have the adequate stalls and cages and facilities. You adhere to the appropriate air protocols and procedures. And you're well versed in terms of quarantine documentation and other issues. Now, animals are carried by freighter and they're also carried by passenger aircraft. Freighters more likely the larger type of animals, and pets and the like could easily go into passenger aircraft. Anybody involved in that particular sector would be right across IATA's live animal regulation, which is the worldwide standard for transporting live animals. The next category I want to have a look at is chemicals. Chemicals is a significant category in its own right. Basic chemicals around about 2%, pharmaceuticals 1.8%, and other range of other chemicals. So 7.5% is a significant category in its own right. Validated, if we have a look at that unit price, once again, basic chemicals up around about 90 units per kilo, pharmaceuticals 326. So you can see where a lot of the interest is going in terms of pharmaceuticals, because it's right in that sweet spot, if you like, in terms of having the right value to weight ratio. So as I said, 7.5%, 10% of value and 139 euros per kilo. It's a strongly growing sector. So that's very positive when it comes to demand, and has grown about 5.6% over the last 10 years, which is over and above that standard rate for air cargo. One of the main elements of this is pharmaceuticals, and they've got almost a 2% share and expected to grow quite significantly. Value is quite significant at 6%, and $326 per kilo, euros per kilo is particularly high. There is also a strong amount of interest from sea cargo to take advantage of this opportunity. Now, when we talk about the pharmaceutical industry, what we're talking about is an industry that markets drugs globally. So they're moving vaccines and medicines around the globe. And it's very heavily regulated. And that's one of the main reasons why perishables lend themselves to the air cargo sector, because of their perishable nature. So the movement of pharmaceuticals is under a strict regime, and anybody that does that has to provide proof that they're able to move those goods under a constant temperature. And of course, air cargo can do that. In terms of the market growing, it's expected to grow by 6.2%, so increase growth to 2022, which puts it at about $1.2 trillion in prescription drug sales. Now, just want to finish off with just a couple of characteristics about the pharmaceutical market. Why is the pharmaceutical market growing so quickly? Well, a couple of things. One of it's to do with demographics and population. We've got an ageing population in most of the developing countries, and and also general population is growing older, living longer, healthier lives, and probably relying on a lot of those medicines and vaccines to allow them to do so. The other reason is the market's growing by virtue of a lot of the products actually coming off patent. So what I mean by that is that anybody who comes up with a new drug, which is new to the world, can apply for a patent. And what that patent allows it to do is to develop that drug, and it means that no other company can actually compete with the sale of that particular drug. So you're the only company that can manufacture it, produce it, and market and sell that particular drug. However, that regime is around about a 20-year window. Now, the patent is usually sought after very early in that 20 years. That's during the formative period of even confirming that that drug is appropriate for the population. So it's before the clinical trials begin. By the time the clinical trials actually give that a tick and they can then go to market, there's usually only a window of 7 to 12 years. As soon as those 12 years are up, anybody else can then come into the market and market those drugs as a generic drug. So they can't use the name of that drug that everybody's grown up with, but they can use other drugs. And the way that they actually get business is that these generic drugs are relatively low in price. So if you've ever gone into a chemist and you've asked for a particular prescription type drug, and the person over the counter says to you, "Oh, would you like the generic?" What they're saying is that they can give you the same drug, it just hasn't got that brand name. And it is a method of actually growing the market. And many of these drugs are at a lower price, that they're increasing the market, and those generic drug companies are usually getting about 90% of the sales. So what that information that we just that I introduced is a really good basis for a business to make some decisions about the customers that it wants to target with its products. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use that information as a general rule of thumb in terms of volumes, in terms of categories, as a way of segmenting the market. Because in many ways, ultimately, the management of an air cargo business is required to identify where its customers are. And this information can be a very useful tool. So, I mentioned segmentation. We're not going to dwell on segmentation, but I've got a small definition there for those who haven't come across segmentation before. And segmentation is groups of potential customers with homogeneous attributes who are likely to exhibit similar responses to a company's marketing mix. Bit of an academic type definition. In layman's terms, segmentation is grouping customers who show similar characteristics. And the idea behind that is that people with similar characteristics are hopefully going to act in the same way. And if you've got a group of customers that you can isolate that are going to act in the same way, you can present your products and services to them. In other words, you can market towards them your business with a hope that they're going to take up your business's services. Is everybody reasonably comfortable with that idea, that general proposition? Okay. Now, there are many ways to segment a market. Demographics, psychographics, behavioural, benefits, a range of different approaches. I'm going to put forward an approach which is supported by Holloway, DeGarnis and Shaw as a suggested approach to segmenting the air freight market. So it will give you an opportunity to isolate groups of whom you will present your products and services to, and the characteristics that this segmentation is based on is shippers' motivation and also urgency of delivery. And they come up with 4 segments. Emergency freight segment, high value freight segment, routine perishable freight segment, and routine non-perishable freight segment. And they also put forward the proposition that the urgency of delivery has got a significant impact on the price sensitivity of any products that find themselves in those groups. Is everybody reasonably comfortable with those 4 groupings? Okay, excuse me. Looking at the first segment is the emergency freight segment. So this is a grouping of customers where transportation speed is essential. Everybody in this group require their goods very, very quickly. When it comes to the shipping cost, the cost of their cargo, and the actual commodity value, it's unimportant. They've got goods that need to get somewhere on an urgent basis. This is, while we can isolate that group, if you like, as a potential lucrative group for an air cargo carrier, it's got very relatively low volumes are going to make up that particular segment. Now, making it easier for a business is if you can sub-segment that segment. In other words, are there any individual groupings of customers that you can find in that particular group of customers? Because the more you can segment the market is going to give you the best opportunity for you to market your products and promote yourself to those particular customers. So I'm suggesting a couple of additional groupings. One is an operating emergency. So this is a situation where urgently needed spare parts, for example, might be oil rig parts. Another sub-segment of is a medical emergency. So customers who urgently need body organs or medicines, vaccines, for example. And the third one is a marketing emergency, which is shipments that have to be delivered within a tight time frame. So potentially they could be sub-segments for you to target with your products and services. Is everybody comfortable with that general proposition, a main segment and some isolated groups of customers? Though not to say that there may be some other groupings within that segment. I'm just putting forward 3 subgroups within that particular group. When we look at the high value freight segment, high value are customers with products which are high value in relation to their weight, relative to their weight. So I'm looking at gold, jewellery, artwork, that particular type of customer. The determining factor is more than just speed. They actually require a high level of security and a high level of safety. So that differentiates them a little bit from the previous category and may present you with an opportunity to isolate those customers easier. Speed of the shipment is important, and that's mainly because the quicker you get those products to the customer, it minimises the amount of exposure that it might have en route. As with the previous category, there are some subcategories of customers that you can find within that group. Shipping cost is relatively unimportant to these particular persons. One is, for example, a liquid assets protection. So customers who are seeking to protect their minerals or currency, gold, silver, jewels or banknotes. Another grouping could be cultural assets protection. So these are customers that have valuable artwork, have valuable cultural artefacts that need to move those goods. For example, terracotta army. Everybody comfortable with the high value segment? Yep. Okay. We're now going to move to the third segment. Bearing in mind this is based on the motivations of the shipper and the urgency of the goods. And this is the routine perishable freight segment. So this is goods that could be physically or commercially perishable. Speed is very important, and that's mainly to get the goods to sit on the shelf. The thing about perishable goods, as I mentioned before, they're only viable as long as the customer is prepared to pay a premium for those goods. So it's not, this particular segment is, and air cargo is not appropriate for all perishable goods. It is a category that is competing very strongly with other modes. We can segment this as well, and we can find some groupings. And the one is physically perishable. So we're talking about foodstuffs, cut flowers, those type of things that typically are more in demand during seasonal situations, seasonal fluctuation. And another segment is the temperature sensitive perishability. And when we talk about temperature sensitivity, we're talking about things such as pharmaceuticals that require the unbroken cool chain. We've also got commercial perishability. So these are customers with fashion, clothing, toys, newspapers that have got a short saleability cycle. And the fourth section is live perishability. So pets, animals, zoo, exotics, those type of things. So that's an indication of a sub-segment that you could choose as a business to target with your goods. So you're looking for customers that are shipping those type of goods. Anybody got any questions about the third segment? Sound pretty reasonable? Okay, so the fourth one is this idea of routine, non-perishable freight segment. And this is the largest share of the air freight market. And in many ways, if you think back to those categories that we looked at up front, where manufactured goods and machines were about 66%, this is probably where this particular market segment is sitting. Speed is important, but it's not as time sensitive as those other segments. And it also competes most closely with surface transport in the same way that perishables do. Some indicative sub-segments that you might want to target the customers are high-tech electrical finished goods, so electrical machines, telecommunications equipment and computers. Non-electrical finished goods, so engines and parts. Non-electrical and intermediate goods. So these are those parts and components, semi-manufactured goods that fit into that global value chain. And the fourth one is consumer finished goods, clothing and footwear, of more of a lower priced item. And that rounds out a segmentation of the air cargo market, and something that you'll be able to use when you get to the third assignment and you're making some decisions about which markets you can choose. So you can use that information to make selections of what your air cargo carrier is going to target with its new aircraft that it's bringing online. Has anybody got any questions? Okay. Now, would you like me to continue to roll on? That wasn't as mind-numbing as it could have been, perhaps. You happy for me to roll on? Okay. So last week we looked at the major traffic lanes, and we looked at each traffic lane in terms of volume, the volumes moving from those traffic lanes. So what we're now going to do is we're going to attach some products to each of those trade lanes. So as we saw last week, that major trade lane is Asia, North America, Europe to Asia, North America to Europe. That's that 50% idea across the Northern Hemisphere. Asia itself, almost 10%. The Middle East to Europe, and North America to Latin America. I didn't speak too much about that. I'll be able to introduce you to that particular grouping, which is 2.2%. When you think about it, the total intra-Europe cargo movement is 2%, so 2.2% from North America to Latin America is not insignificant in its own right. So just having a look at the first trade route I want to have a look at, and we spoke about last week, was Europe to and from Asia. In terms of tonnage, and we didn't mention that, that's about 10% of the tonnage is moved through that particular trade route. We also know already a significant imbalance exists on that particular trade route from the imbalance from Asia to Europe. However, this is reducing It's now down to 47% from 71% in 2005. If we have a quick snapshot at the look at the commodities there, machines, perishables, computers, all those type of commodities that we've already spoken about, which you would expect to find in a profile of air cargo. The machines and transportation equipment going towards the manufacturing capability of Asia. Computer products, mainly concentrating around semiconductors, which are also going to go into the manufacturing of computers in Asia. And I suppose the other main element of that is, as you can see, you've got perishables at around about 11%. You've got apparel at 3.7%. Perhaps those perishables could be taking up some of those space because of that imbalance between the region. But apparel is an interesting one, 3.7%. And the argument there could be they're taking up the opportunity in the growing middle class of China and India. If we have a look at the goods the other way, we have got a different sort of mix. What we can see here is over and above, we've got over 50% of the products in their commodity types are high-tech goods. And so laptops, integrated circuits, LCD displays and things like that, which is representative of goods coming from a manufacturing region and going to a consumption region. In terms of those high-tech exports, the two areas that really stand out there are Taiwan and China. And we're also seeing apparel is a significant contributor to the movement of commodities. And this is, and the main areas of the production of that apparel are typically China and India. Okay, moving on to the region of North America to and from Asia, standing at about 20%. That's probably similar, very similar to that in Europe and Asia. Tonnes around about the same amount, around about 10% of all tonnage moves along that route. A significant imbalance, more than the imbalance to Europe, 67%. Look, I suppose it goes without saying that this imbalance has certainly upset those people in high places in Washington, and they're seeking to redress this imbalance. If we look at the types of goods going from North America to Asia, I suppose what stands out there, there's a significant amount of electrical machinery and general industrial machinery. So over 20%. So what we're saying there is that there are a lot of goods that go into the ability to have a manufacturing capability of finished goods. Perishables are also a significant volume, and I think once again that's just representative of the fact that there's such strong imbalance that the rates are dropped to enable perishables to take advantage of that particular route. But there must be an underlying demand, and the suggestion there is that those middle classes of China and India are wanting to more high quality products. If we look at Asia to North America, so we're looking at the goods going the other way, essentially that's dominated by telecom equipment, so we're talking about mobile phones in the main. So a third of everything that goes from Asia to North America is going to be in that area of mobile phones. In addition to that, the other ones that really stick out there are apparel and textiles, but that is an area that's been reducing over time. North America and Europe, around about 10%. About half the volumes moving between North America and Europe versus North America and Asia and Europe and Asia. In terms of tonnage, 6.5%, so relatively low, you could argue. And as a snapshot of that particular trading lane, you'd say that not a lot has changed over a period of time. And you might even say that 6.5% in tonne volume is probably representative of only 40% of the movement of aircraft across that particular route are freighters. So it's a lower level of freighters where you've got 80% of freighters moving between Europe and Asia. In terms of the commodity types, quite interesting in many ways. It's very discrete. We've only unable to put 24% of freight into a category. So they strongly focus on key manufacturing areas, chemicals, machinery, metals, computers, transport equipment and documents. Quite huge volumes of goods going across there in those particular categories. And I suppose if you had a look at where the main markets are for the US, the EU really does stand out there. In terms of machinery, for an example, it's their third largest market. Now, where it does get interesting is when you have a look at the goods moving from Europe to North America, and if you've got you'll note that all of those goods are also the same goods that are going the other way. So what we're saying there is that both those regions have got similar export profiles, so they exhibit really close similarities in terms of the goods going both ways. And all of those goods account for 75%, so those 6 categories account for about 75% of the goods moved. Don't see any perishables in there. What else is missing? Apparel, perhaps? Okay, so a new region, we haven't looked at this before, North America to Latin America, around a bit over 2%, a little bit more than is moving around Europe. Tonnage, relatively small. That also, what that's suggesting is that perhaps most of the movement is going to be in passenger aircraft rather than freighter aircraft. And there's a significant imbalance in favour of Latin America. So in 2007, 50% more air cargo was carried from Latin America to North America. It's now up to about 70%. So even higher imbalance than there is between Europe and Asia. Commodity types from North America to Latin America. Hard to really put a strong identification on significant categories. Probably the one that stands out there is going to be industrial and specialised machinery. So this is not significant machine. This is relatively small machinery that will enable the Latin American manufacturing economy to manufacture durable and consumer goods. And many of the other categories that you might associate with air cargo. And if you look through them, computers, telephones, medical, aircraft parts, automotive, chemical, they've all got a high value to weight. So that seems to be the highest differentiator there. And for something really completely different in terms of profile of exports, we only have to look at Latin America to North America. Fish, flowers, vegetables, fruit, nuts. So almost 65-70% of perishable items are going from Latin America to North America. So big change, a big difference, and obviously probably reflective of the fact that, and it's actually increased over time, so it's actually been resilient in tough economic times. And it probably reflects the fact that most of those goods are coming through to North America in the belly hold rather than freighters, as I said before. Okay, any questions about the makeup of commodities by virtue of trade lanes? All over that? Okay. Okay, I'll keep rolling on because I can just see that you're up to keep going. So what I want to finish off with was a brief discussion about the cool chain. Now, the reason for this in many ways is that if you are an aircraft carrier, a business who's carrying air cargo, and you've got an inclination to target a perishable market, as we've seen, perishable can be quite an opportunity for some businesses, depending on perhaps the type of aircraft. You would have to be very au fait with the cool chain. So when we talk about cool chain, we're talking about perishables that are vulnerable to temperature exchanges. As they move from the point of origin to the end customer, they're kept in a cool condition. And that can be done in many ways. Because ultimately, we know that perishables are called that for a reason, that they perish over time. There's plenty of examples of perishables. There's a multitude that we could choose from. I've just plucked out a few here that might be impacted by the cool chain. So if you're moving roses from Ethiopia en route to Europe via Dubai, there's going to be some level of exchange of plane there. So you need to maintain that cool chain as you move those goods onto a new aircraft to take it to its final destination. And the same goes for shellfish, same goes for cherries, and the same goes for pharmaceuticals. So you need to have the expertise and the ability to facilitate that on behalf of your customer. So when you're looking at yourself in terms of the products that you will require as a air cargo carrier to facilitate that, you're going to require a range of infrastructure to make that happen. So when we look at the marketing mix, I don't want to digress too much onto the marketing mix, one of those elements is product. Well, when we're talking about the product, we're talking about the infrastructure and the requirements that you need to have in place to satisfy your customer market. Digressed enough there. So, the cool chain is this idea of an approach to moving the goods from point of origin to end customer, keeping it at a constant temperature. Now, typically this is underpinned by three key approaches. Firstly, you need specialised equipment, so that would show up in your product and infrastructure along the way. You also need a level of expertise and knowledge about the market. You need to be au fait with the appropriate rules and regulations of moving this type of product. And finally, for those businesses that really want to succeed well, they've probably got to have a quality management system in place. So your quality management system is this idea of strategically looking at the way that you move your goods from point of origin to the end customer. So it's building up policies, it's building up procedures, and typically it's getting some level of certification from the ISO. It's also taking the approach of analysing the shipment, measuring the shipment, controlling the shipment, documenting the shipment, and validating the shipment are all elements of a business who's taking on a quality management system approach. If we put that into steps, it might look something like this. First part of the step is the idea of the supply procurement. Supply procurement, farm harvest, pre-cooling, packaging. The next step is moving it from the farm or whatever the manufacturing facility might be and using inland transport. So the cool chain is going to be refrigerated trucks, it's going to be refrigerated ULDs. The airport itself, cool rooms, packaging which is appropriate for whatever goods that you're moving, and perhaps even using cool dollies. Inland transport, refrigerated trucks, ULDs again, So just duplicating step 2 until you get it to the end customer, just depending on what sort of premises the end customer might have, shop or supermarket. Ultimately though, for an air cargo carrier, most of the services that you're offering are going to be centred around the airport. It's unlikely for perishable products that you'll be getting too much involved outside of that. Not to say that you might, but quite possible. Possibly not. Okay, now look, a couple of little terms. I mentioned infrastructure. One of those terms is a cool dolly. So within your infrastructure, a cool dolly looks something like this. So it's that box on wheels that you can see there. It's a mobile temperature container. Essentially what you're doing is you're putting your goods in there. It can carry a number of ULDs, and you're moving it from the warehouse over to your aircraft. And the idea there is you're continuing that idea of the cool chain. So you're assisting the airport staff to do so. I think that says everything that needs to. And look, the real rationale behind that is that they're just trying to normalise the temperature so that there's no spike. A more sophisticated piece of infrastructure that you might have in your business is what's called a temperature control container. Typically, so these are an innovation, a self-contained innovation if you like, that assist in the movement of perishable items. And they've got a number of advantages. First and foremost, it's an end-to-end cooling system. So this is more likely to start off at the shipper's premises. They're going to have one of these. They may hire that off you. They might hire it off another company. And if they do a lot of it, they might even buy one. But they're not cheap. And this is going to give them that ability to carry the goods at constant temperature. So it's a boosting of life form of technology. Some of the key features, that's another example of one, is that it's the material that makes it up is an insulated material. That's the shell. It's underpinned by electrical heating and also compressor. So when it's available to use electricity, it can plug it in. When it doesn't need, when there's no electricity, such as moving on the aircraft, it's got a compressor cooling system with rechargeable batteries. Enhanced air circulation, another one of the benefits. It's easy to control, simple operation, and you also get I suppose, a chain of knowledge of all the movements of temperature over that period of time. And as you can see right on the bottom there, it's got a couple of little slots there. So it's very compatible with forklifts or whatever moving equipment that you're using. So my final comment on the cool chain is that as useful and valuable as one of those sophisticated containers might be, they're not the only option available to you. And really, if you think about it, if you're carrying some perishables with a low unit value, you're not going to put them in that particular type of carrier. It's an expensive option. However, there are a number of different options that you can take up. You don't require that level of sophistication. And they include ice, as simple as ice, to keep the perishables cool, and also as simple as a protective cover, which can also shield temperature and keep the goods in an appropriate manner. As I mentioned before, if you were going down this track, you'd be going down this track, you'd be all over IATA's perishable cargo regulations, so you'd, which is the essential reference to the movement of perishables, and probably have somebody who's quite aware of the movement of these goods, or at least you've trained them up on your staff. So, any questions about the cool chain? Okay. So, today, we talked about the main categories of goods transported by air carriers. We looked at how they're moved from region to region and the type of goods they are. And we also touched on the cool chain, which would be very appropriate for a business marketing themselves towards customers and shippers who carry perishables. So, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.